Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this edition of Touring with Travis. My name is Travis Gilbert. I'm the educator and collections coordinator for the Old Baldy Foundation. And behind the camera here, we have our executive director, Chris Webb. I lowered my voice. I realized that I don't have to shout or project as much anymore because we have this fancy new toy from Kara. Kara is one of our listeners, and her son Jace. She's an educator from out in Kentucky, Tennessee, Kentucky. And she was so generous in purchasing this fancy microphone for us to be using during our live broadcast. So, Kara, thank you so very much for purchasing this equipment for us. Even not during a pandemic, we're going to continue these videos with our social media presence. This has been such a great endeavor. It's brought people into the fold of our mission that we had not reached previously. And with the nature of Bald Head Island, folks, even when things are normal, they don't get to see this island as much as they probably wish they could see it. Perhaps they come here for vacation, or they come here a few weeks out of the year with a second home and rent it elsewhere or elsewise. So these videos have been really a wonderful tool, a wonderful piece of education, a way to bring people to Bald Head Island who may be states or thousands of miles away. So this microphone is going to get a lot of use in the coming months and coming years. So thank you very much, Kara. And y'all out there, join me in thanking Kara the next time you see her comment or whatnot. So speaking of, I'm going to be following along here on our Facebook page. I would love if you gave us a shout out in the comments. Let us know where you're listening from. Let us know your connection to Bald Head Island. If you have any questions or would like us to elaborate on something, we'd love to hear from you. Let me pull it up here. All right. It sounds good to me. It sounds like it's working, right, Chris? So we are out here today at East Beach at one of our lovely green signs to talk about the wreck of the USS Peterhoff. So the USS Peterhoff gets its name from Peterhoff Palace in Russia. That's because this ship, before the American Civil War, was built for the Tsar of Russia. That's where she gets her start. Curious enough how a ship intended for the Tsar of Russia ends up here offshore of East Beach on Bald Head Island. Well, let's back up to right before the Civil War. The British end up purchasing this ship from the Tsar of Russia, and it is outfitted in the early years of the American Civil War to be a blockade runner. So blockade runners are ships that are mostly built by England and are under the command or under the auspices of English merchants. And these blockade runners are loaded up with manufactured goods and war materials produced in Europe. They cross, they sometimes cross the Atlantic Ocean, but oftentimes they're waiting in neutral ports in the Caribbean. Think of the Bahamas or even out in the Atlantic and Bermuda. And these blockade runners are used to carry those war materials and those manufactured goods into the Southern Confederacy, where they could drop off those goods, pick up cotton and raw agricultural goods that would be exported out of the Confederacy and end up being traded for more manufactured goods to be imported back into the Confederacy. So the Peterhoff, we believe, or most sources believe, were used for that endeavor. Why I say believed is because in 1864, the Peterhoff was in St. Thomas, and she was flying a British flag, and there was an American naval force under the command of Charles Wilkes. And Charles Wilkes had a hunch that the Peterhoff was intended for the Southern Confederacy. And he boarded her after firing a shot over her deck or over her bow. And when he got on board, he looked for the Peterhoff's papers. And the Peterhoff's papers said that this ship was intended for Mexico, not for the Southern Confederacy. Well, it wasn't until a sailor aboard the USS the Peterhoff, she didn't have the USS by that, a sailor aboard the Peterhoff let it slip. All right, he says that, no, we're not intended for Mexico, as our ship's papers say. We're intended for Texas. So clearly, to Charles Wilkes, the Peterhoff had forged its papers. The papers were lying. They weren't going to Mexico. They were going into Texas, which was a state in the Southern Confederacy. And all those materials aboard the Peterhoff were intended to be used against the Union Army and against the Union Navy once they arrived in that Confederate port within Texas. So Charles Wilkes took that sailor's loose lips and he said that we're going to seize the Peterhoff. I don't care if you have a British flag on board. We're going to seize this ship. And any ships that were seized by the United States Navy during the American Civil War would have been sold in what we call a prize of war. It was like an auction. You're auctioning off contraband of war. And it just so happened that the Peterhoff, when she was sold in this prize court, was purchased by the United States Navy, and she was outfitted to become the blockade runners' nemesis. They are called blockaders. These are the Union naval ships that are lurking offshore in the Southern Confederacy that are searching for the blockade runners in order to seize them and prevent this illicit trade from occurring between England and the European powers and the Southern Confederacy that had rebelled against the United States of America. So let's check in on Facebook and see what's going on out there in the world. If you're listening, hey, Emmeline and Dan from Earlyville, thanks for tuning in. It's great to hear from you. Kathy Gilbert is watching. Good afternoon, Kathy. It's good to hear from you. Anybody else out there listening, give us a shout out in the comments. Let us know where you're listening from. Let us know what your connection to Bald Head Island is. Of course, if you have anything you'd like us to elaborate on, give us a shout down there.
We have a live audience today, too.
Yeah, we do have a live audience here. So, to recap, the Peterhoff is built for the Tsar of Russia. The British, before the American Civil War, end up purchasing the Peterhoff. They intend her to be used as a ship delivering war materials into the Southern Confederacy. And when Union Naval Commander Charles Wilkes gets a hunch of what she's being used for, he seizes the Peterhoff during a prize of war court, and she is outfitted to now join the Union Navy in blockading the Southern Confederacy. And where do they send her? Well, they send her none other to Bald Head Island, all right? She is placed in the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron, who is responsible for blockading two inlets separated by Bald Head Island. We have New Inlet to our north near modern-day Fort Fisher. That was created by a hurricane in 1761 and would be closed up by the year 1891 by a man-made dam. But that inlet was opened during the Civil War. And the other inlet this blockading squadron was responsible for patrolling was Old Inlet. That's the natural mouth of the Cape Fear River that you cross on the ferry to get on and off of Bald Head Island today. So two inlets, the blockading squadron around Bald Head Island were responsible for patrolling, again to prevent these blockade runners like the former Peterhoff from entering the Cape Fear River and dropping off those valuable war materials in Wilmington. Well, the Peterhoff only lasts for a few days. That's the terrible irony of this story. She arrives down here in late February of 1864, and by March 6, 1864, she's accidentally rammed by a fellow Federal blockader called the USS Monticello. The USS Monticello was on its way to Beaufort, North Carolina, to be resupplied with coal. There was a big coal depot in Beaufort, which fell to Union troops in the spring of 1862. about 2 years prior to the Peterhoff being rammed down here on Bald Head Island. Well, rather than going outside of the federal blockading line, going well out to sea in order to avoid her fellow federal warships, the Monticello, in the darkness of the night of March 6, 1864, went inside and through the blockading line off of East Beach. And unfortunately, because she decided to go in and through her fellow blockaders, she accidentally rammed into the Peterhoff in the darkness of the night. And the Peterhoff sank within minutes. It was very, very quick. All the sailors aboard the Peterhoff were saved by their fellow federal sailors offshore. But the sinking of the Peterhoff did not go unnoticed by Confederate troops that were stationed here on Bald Head Island in Fort Holmes. There were at least two Whitworth guns run by Confederate soldiers here on Bald Head Island. And we've discussed a lot of the artillery for Fort Holmes previously on these episodes. A majority of the artillery here at Fort Holmes was immobile, meaning that these were huge, massive pieces of artillery weighing tons upon tons, and once you got them into a position in the fort here on Bald Head Island, you didn't move them again. They stayed put. But at least two guns were mobile, meaning that, like you go to a battlefield today, you see two big wheels on each side of the barrel of that cannon. And you could pick up one end of the cannon with a horse or with man or other animals and move it around as you see fit on the battlefield. Well, two guns, the Whitworth guns, had that type of technology here on Bald Head Island. They were mobile. And we call them Whitworth guns because they were English technology. Americans, neither North or South, could produce Whitworth guns here in America. This was English technology imported through blockade runners like the Peterhoff before she was used by the Yankees. And what made these pieces of artillery so valuable is that they were the first, or one of the first, breech-loading cannons in American history, meaning that they weren't muzzle-loaded. You didn't put the cannonball in the end of the cannon and ram it down into the bottom of the barrel. No, you loaded these cannons, these Whitworth guns, from the back side. They were breech-loading. Breech-loading is very common nowadays, but in 1864 this was very new technology. And in addition to these being breech-loaded cannons, its barrel and its projectile were hexagonal. There were no other hexagonal rifles or projectiles used during the Civil War. This was very new technology that could fire miles upon miles. It has a massive range. And there were at least two of these Whitworth guns, this new technology, employed by Confederate troops on Bald Head Island. So when the Confederates notice that the Peterhoff is sinking off East Beach, they bring their Whitworth guns to around this location, and they begin firing these Whitworth projectiles towards the Peterhoff in order to sink her. From the Confederate perspective, they believe that it is their cannon fire that punctures a hole into the Peterhoff and causes her to sink off of East Beach. The Confederates on Bald Head Island did not realize that Peterhoff had already been rammed by one of her fellow Federal ships, and that is why she was sinking. So if you read the Confederate regimental histories, they truly believe, and they write even after the Civil War, that they are the ones that caused the Peterhoff to sink. But from the Union perspective, the Union understood how the USS Monticello had endangered the Federal warships offshore, rammed the Peterhoff by mistake in the middle of the night, and that is what causes the Peterhoff to sink. Now, I'll read you, I'm going to check in on Facebook, and I'm going to read you the federal report. Chuck, watching from Cleveland, North Carolina. Howdy, Travis. Hello, Chuck. It's great to hear from you. Good afternoon. And Kathy Gilbert from Newville, Pennsylvania. Kathy, it's good to hear from you. So let me read this primary source from the Union perspective. And this is what this is where or how we understood what truly happened to the Peterhoff. It says, from the USS Fort Jackson, one of its fellow federal ships offshore, from Cape Fear River, March 6, 1864. I have to report the loss of the USS Peterhoff, commanded by Acting Volunteer Lieutenant T. Pickering, having been run into and immediately sunk by the USS Monticello at 5:10 a.m. this morning, and now lies in 5 fathoms of water about 1 mile south of Sheephead Rock, south of New Inlet Bar. Officers and crew saved, but the vessel a total loss. The Monticello is from the Western Bar on her way to Beaufort for coal, and with orders to communicate with me here, had gotten within our inner line where she should not have been, and gotten within at that time. To prevent such disasters and to guard against embarrassment of vessels at their night station, I have endeavored to impress upon the commanding officers off Wilmington, returning to the blockade after dark, the necessity of keeping outside the lines till daylight. I enclose the reports of Acting Volunteer Lieutenant Pickering and Lieutenant Cushing. Very respectfully yours, your obedient servant, B.F. Sands, Captain, U.S. Navy. So the Western Bar, he's talking about the mouth of the Cape Fear River where you cross on the ferry to get to Bald Head today. But it was very embarrassing for the Union Navy. To have one of your own ships accidentally ram into another and cause it to sink would have been extremely embarrassing. Now, Lieutenant Cushing, who commanded the USS Monticello when she rammed into the Peterhoff and sank her, would go on after this event to have a long, illustrious career. Not only would he perform a commando raid in Smithville to capture a Confederate officer in downtown Southport today and make it back out to the Union blockading line in the Atlantic Ocean to tell the tale, he also would perform his probably most celebrated feat in Plymouth, North Carolina later this year. There, CSS, Confederate States of America ironclad was stationed. It was called the Albemarle, and another commando raid of sorts, Lieutenant Cushing would go in there and blow up, permanently disabling that Confederate ironclad, and once again escape to live to tell the tale. He had a brother that died at the Battle of Gettysburg, commanding the Union troops that defended Cemetery Ridge during that famed Pickett's Charge. So a long, illustrious family, a long, illustrious career. He had plenty of opportunities to kind of redeem himself from this embarrassing episode off of East Beach. Now, the Peterhoff, it still lies off of East Beach. In the 1970s, I think it was about 1974, there were underwater archaeologists that explored the remains and ended up taking some remains out of the shipwreck at the bottom of the ocean. You can see some of the cannons recovered from the USS Peterhoff on the campus of the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. There is also a cannon at the Carteret County Museum, which is in Morehead City, North Carolina today. And there is also a cannon, I think it was the Parrott Rifles on UNC Wilmington's campus. But there's another cannon located at Fort Fisher on display outside the underwater archaeology offices there on the campus of Fort Fisher. All recovered around 1974 from the remains of the Peterhoff that's still located about a mile offshore of East Beach here on Bald Head Island. All right, let me check back in Facebook and see what's going on out there. Anybody else has any comments or questions? Quiet audience this afternoon.
I can't read mine.
Yeah,
Too bright.
It's very, very bright out here. It's a beautiful day, if you can't tell. All right, folks. Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon. We'll be back for another jam-packed day full of virtual programming tomorrow. We're going to talk a little bit about Benjamin Smith, Governor Benjamin Smith, that owned this island in the early 19th century during our quarantine collections. And then tomorrow afternoon, we'll be taking you back out to a slice of Bald Head Island to talk about its historical significance. And then we're going to take our weekend, and we'll be back next week with even more virtual programs. So we'll see you tomorrow, folks. Thank you for joining us.
You have a very pleasing voice.
Really well done, man.
Thank you.
Smooth as
You
freaking
do.
silk. Honestly,
I
really, really
do
well
a
done.
lot of YouTube channels for instructions, and I have to flip them, but I would listen to you. You've got a nice voice.
Thank you.
Where do we find it? Where do we find this commentary? There's a lot of stuff.